What if everything you thought you knew about classic Hollywood was a carefully crafted illusion? During the golden era of cinema, image wasn't just important, it was everything. Behind the glamorous photos and iconic roles, many celebrities weren't just acting on screen, they were performing off it too. From fake names and falsified birthplaces to erased ethnic backgrounds and invented aristocratic roots, the truth was often buried beneath the spotlight. In this video, we'll uncover the shocking backstories that Hollywood's most beloved stars desperately tried to hide, and the roles they played just to survive. During the golden era of Hollywood, Greer Garson seemed like a woman born of nobility, refined, elegant, and perfectly suited for the dignified roles she played in classic films. But the aristocratic image wasn't reality. It was a creation. For years, MGM's publicity claimed Garson was born in Ireland and descended from the legendary Scottish outlaw Rob Roy. It sounded like the perfect backstory for a wartime heroine. In truth, Garson was born in London in 1904, the daughter of a commercial clerk. She grew up middle class, not among royalty, but in modest surroundings. But that didn't stop the studio from weaving myths into her bio. Press interviews mentioned her Irish roots and even referenced ancient Celtic names to elevate her image. Audiences bought the illusion just as they were meant to. By the time she starred in films like Mrs. Miniver, which won her an Oscar, she had become the face of wartime resilience in vintage cinema. Her accent, her poise, her polished demeanor all reinforced the fiction of noble birth. Even as rumors of her true background surfaced later in her career, she never corrected the story. In Hollywood, truth was negotiable, and Garson knew the value of mystery. Her career wasn't just built on talent, it was built on a beautifully crafted illusion that fit the mold of what classic Hollywood movies demanded. Merle Oberon captivated Hollywood with her elegance, mystery, and striking beauty. But beneath the surface was a secret the studios helped her bury. Born in 1911 as Estelle Merle O'Brien Thompson in Bombay, British India, she was of mixed Anglo-Indian, Maori, and possibly Tamil descent, an identity that didn't align with Hollywood's rigid standards during the golden era. In a time when leading ladies had to appear white, Oberon rewrote her past entirely. She claimed she was born in Tasmania and raised in England, crafting a false narrative of British aristocracy. To maintain the lie, her own mother traveled with her as a maid, speaking only Hindi in public to avoid suspicion. Studio executives worked hard to support the illusion. Cinematographers used soft lighting and heavy makeup to lighten her complexion, and she reportedly avoided sunlight altogether to maintain a more European appearance. By 1935, she was nominated for an Oscar and starring in classic movies like The Dark Angel and Wuthering Heights. But even at the height of her fame, the fear of being exposed haunted her. When reporters began questioning her story in the 1960s, she canceled a planned visit to Tasmania entirely. It wasn't until after her death in 1979 that her true birth record surfaced, shocking fans and film historians. Oberon's carefully manufactured identity wasn't just about fame, it was a survival strategy in an industry that made no room for diversity. And hers was only the beginning. Clark Gable may be remembered as the King of Hollywood, but the truth behind his rise tells a very different story. Born in 1901 in Hopedale, Ohio, Gable's early life had nothing in common with the polished roles he later played in classic movies. He was the son of a hard-working oil driller and spent his youth covered in grease, not glamour. But during the golden era of cinema, a star's background didn't matter, as long as it could be rewritten. Studios didn't just cast Gable, they reconstructed him. With the help of his first wife, acting coach Josephine Dillon, he underwent a complete transformation. His teeth were fixed, his posture corrected, and his working-class speech replaced with the deep, refined tone that would echo through vintage Hollywood films. By the time he starred in Gone with the Wind, Gable embodied everything the industry idolized: charm, strength, sophistication. What audiences didn't see was the man who once sold neckties to survive or worked long hours in factories. His past was quietly buried beneath tailored suits and studio-made press stories. In the golden spotlight of Hollywood cinema, Gable became a legend. But off-screen, he remained grounded, a man who never quite forgot where he came from, even if the world did. Sophia Loren is remembered as the eternal symbol of classic glamour, but her journey to the bright lights of Hollywood began in the rubble of post-war Naples. Born Sofia Villani Ciccoloni in 1934, she grew up malnourished, huddling in bomb shelters and sharing a single bed with her mother and sister. Poverty shaped her, yet the studios of the golden era of cinema would sell a very different origin story. When producer Carlo Ponti discovered her at a beauty pageant, the reinvention started. A new surname, Lauren, inspired by Swedish star Märta Turin, was crafted to sound continental yet neutral. Elocution lessons softened her thick Neapolitan accent, so audiences of vintage movies could imagine she'd been born to elegance. Press interviews dwelled on natural sophistication, quietly skipping the hunger that once left her too frail to stand. On screen, she dazzled in films like Two Women, which earned her the first acting Oscar ever awarded for a non-English role. Off-screen, she kept a photo of her bombed-out childhood home in her purse, a secret reminder of the life she'd had to bury. While studios highlighted champagne premieres and couture gowns, Lauren quietly funded hospitals in Italy, insisting, "I am still the skinny girl from Pozzuoli." Her story proves that in Hollywood movies, reinvention could turn hardship into legend, yet the bravest stars never let the world forget where the legend truly began. Cary Grant wasn't born into elegance, he created it. Before he became a symbol of sophistication in classic Hollywood cinema, he was Archibald Leach, a poor boy from Bristol, England. His early life was marked by hardship, including the trauma of believing his mother had died, when in fact she'd been institutionalized by his father. Determined to escape, young Archie joined an acrobatic troupe at 14 and traveled to America. But in the polished world of golden-era Hollywood, Archibald Leach wasn't leading man material, so he erased himself. He adopted a new name, refined his thick accent into a polished transatlantic tone, and carefully curated a persona of effortless charm. He didn't just change his voice, he changed his history. Some reports claim he even hinted he was born in the US to sidestep anti-British bias in Hollywood movies. The real man was working class, self-taught, and quietly haunted by his past. But the world saw only Cary Grant, the perfect gentleman of vintage film. He starred in timeless classics like To Catch a Thief and North by Northwest, becoming one of the most bankable actors of his time. But behind the flawless smile, he once confessed, "Everyone wants to be Cary Grant, so do I." Even he knew the persona had taken over. In Hollywood, image was everything, and no one wore their mask more convincingly than Grant. Rita Hayworth was the ultimate golden era dream, a radiant beauty who lit up the screen in classic Hollywood films. But the woman the world fell in love with wasn't who she was born to be. Her real name was Margarita Carmen Canzino, and her identity as a Latina woman didn't fit the image studios wanted for their leading ladies. In the 1930s, Hollywood ethnicity was a barrier, not a feature. So Hayworth's transformation began. Her hairline was painfully altered through electrolysis to make her look less foreign. Her dark hair was dyed a fiery red, and her name changed to something easier, whiter: Rita Hayworth. Slowly, Margarita disappeared. Columbia Pictures pushed her as the all-American goddess, even as she struggled privately with the disconnect between her heritage and her public persona. Audiences adored her in vintage movies like Gilda, unaware of the woman behind the performance. "Men fell in love with Gilda," she once said, "but they wake up with me." That single quote revealed the deep conflict she lived with, trapped in a role crafted by a studio system that prized image over truth. Despite her success, she never stopped feeling the loss of who she had been before Hollywood cinema got hold of her. Hayworth's story is a haunting reminder that in classic movies, even a name could cost you everything. Before he became a Hollywood heartthrob, Tony Curtis was Bernard Schwartz, a kid from the Bronx born to Hungarian Jewish immigrants. His real life was a far cry from the glamorous image he would later project in classic cinema. Raised in poverty and speaking mostly Hungarian as a child, Curtis grew up in a world that didn't seem destined for stardom. But when he arrived in Hollywood in the late 1940s, he knew exactly what he had to do. The studios changed his name to Tony Curtis, short, catchy, and free of ethnic markers. They sent him to speech lessons to smooth out his thick New York accent. His Jewish background? Quietly brushed aside in favor of a more all-American persona that would sell in vintage movies. Curtis became a fixture of the golden era, known for his good looks and roles in films like Some Like It Hot and Sweet Smell of Success. But behind the scenes, he often felt like an outsider playing a part. He later admitted, "I had to hide who I was. That's the price of making it in this town." In a time when image was carefully constructed, Tony Curtis was proof that in Hollywood movies, being yourself wasn't always an option. You had to become who the studios wanted, or be left behind. In the glamorous world of golden-era Hollywood, few stars shined brighter than Joan Crawford. But the woman behind the poised, powerful screen presence wasn't born into the world of classic movies. She was born Lucille Fay Lesure in 1904, far from the glitz of vintage cinema and even further from the high society upbringing she claimed. Her transformation into Joan Crawford began when MGM held a fan magazine contest to rename her, a publicity stunt that erased her past with a single headline. Crawford didn't just change her name, she changed her entire story. She claimed she attended elite boarding schools and came from wealth and refinement. In truth, she came from hardship, raised in Texas, working as a laundress and a waitress after her parents separated. But in Hollywood, image was everything. Crawford allegedly falsified school records to get into college, a stepping stone into acting. From there, she mastered the role of the perfect star, confident, glamorous, and untouchable. She became a force in film, dominating the screen in classics like Mildred Pierce, yet never acknowledging the poverty and pain of her early years. As decades passed, her carefully curated image began to crack. Behind the scenes were 4 failed marriages, a bitter feud with Bette Davis, and her daughter's shocking memoir, Mommy Dearest. Still, Joan Crawford remains one of cinema's most iconic figures, a living example of how in Hollywood's golden age, even the truth was just another story to rewrite. In the polished world of golden-era Hollywood, few stars looked more like the perfect leading man than Rock Hudson. With his towering height and square-jawed charm, he seemed born for classic cinema. But Hudson wasn't his real name, and his image was a total invention. Born Roy Harold Scherer Jr. in Illinois, he arrived in Hollywood in the late 1940s as a shy, struggling truck driver with dreams of stardom and no formal acting experience. That didn't matter. His agent Henry Wilson gave him a new name and a carefully designed backstory. The studios claimed he was a rugged Midwesterner with a heroic past. They sold him as the all-American icon, the kind of man who belonged on magazine covers and movie posters. Behind the scenes, though, Hudson was hiding a truth that could have ended his career in an instant. In a time when Hollywood films demanded perfection, being openly gay was out of the question. The studio arranged a sudden marriage timed just as rumors began swirling to protect the illusion. Hudson lived in fear that the fantasy would collapse. For decades, the public embraced the roles he played in vintage movies: smooth-talking lovers, brave soldiers, wholesome husbands. But when his AIDS diagnosis was revealed in 1984, it shattered the facade. The man who had embodied Hollywood's ideal became a symbol of its silence. His story is a stark reminder of how far the industry would go to protect an image, even if it meant erasing the man behind it. To audiences of golden-era Hollywood, Fred Astaire floated through classic films like A Man Born to Dance. But the elegance you saw on screen was anything but effortless. Born Frederick Austerlitz in Omaha, Nebraska, Astaire was the child of Austrian immigrants, and his journey to stardom was one of intense discipline and total reinvention. In the early 1900s, as anti-German sentiment began rising, his family changed their name to Astaire to blend in. By the time he hit Hollywood, studios helped polish the rest of the image. Press materials painted him as a natural prodigy, someone who barely needed to rehearse. The reality? He trained endlessly, obsessing over every step and every scene. He demanded full-body shots in all his movies so the audience could see he wasn't hiding behind camera tricks. Financial struggles from his vaudeville years were erased. His stage beginnings with Sister Adele were downplayed. What mattered to Hollywood cinema was the myth, that Astaire was born a star. And the myth worked. He became the face of vintage musicals, starring in iconic films like Top Hat and Swing Time. But behind the polished image was a man who worked himself to exhaustion to maintain the illusion. Fred Astaire wasn't just performing on screen, he was performing the version of himself that Hollywood needed him to be. If any star epitomized golden-era Hollywood adventure, it was Errol Flynn, dashing hero of classic movies like Captain Blood and The Adventures of Robin Hood. Audiences saw a fearless aristocrat who fenced at dawn and romanced by moonlight. But that image was stitched together by Flynn himself, then amplified by the studio machine. Born in 1909 in Tasmania to a biology professor, Flynn's real childhood was respectable, even bookish. Yet press profiles claimed he'd wrestled crocodiles in New Guinea, struck gold in the jungle, and sailed as a mercenary on exotic seas. Many of those tales came straight from Flynn's own interviews. Warner Brothers simply printed the legend. In the myth-hungry world of vintage cinema, truth checked its coat at the door. Off-screen, Flynn's life spiraled into debts, scandals, and courtrooms, each episode fueling the rogue persona that kept him bankable. Reporters dubbed him "in like Flynn," and the studio quietly paid legal fees to protect their priceless brand. Even Flynn's memoir, My Wicked, Wicked Ways, blurred lines between confession and performance, admitting some stories were invented while dropping new, wilder ones to keep the spotlight hot. His swashbuckling facade made him immortal in Hollywood film history, but it also caged him inside a character he could never outgrow. In the end, the man who forged his own legend discovered that legends, like scripts, aren't easily rewritten once the public buys a ticket. In the polished glare of golden-era Hollywood, Tab Hunter looked like he'd stepped straight out of a surf magazine and onto the soundstage. Blonde hair, blue eyes, and a grin that sold tickets to every corner of classic cinema. Yet the studio idol fans adored in 1950s movies began life as Arthur Andrew Kelm, a shy kid from a rough Los Angeles neighborhood who preferred figure skating to football. Agent Henry Wilson, famed for manufacturing leading men, supplied the first reinvention. A new name that sounded breezy and unforgettable, Tab Hunter, and a manufactured backstory brimming with wholesome Americana. Warner Brothers then staged newsreel dates with starlets like Natalie Wood and Debbie Reynolds, producing photo spreads of perfect romance that existed only in press kits. In reality, Hunter was working overtime just to keep the fantasy alive, terrified that any slip might reveal the truth of his private life in a town where authenticity could end a career overnight. When Confidential magazine threatened to expose him in 1955, the studio allegedly bargained Hunter's secrets in exchange for juicier gossip on someone else. The deal bought silence, but the price was constant vigilance. Every premiere, every interview, every beach blanket snapshot had to reinforce the illusion of the all-American dreamboat headlining vintage films such as Battle Cry and Damn Yankees. Decades later, long after the spotlight dimmed, Hunter reclaimed his story in his candid memoir Tab Hunter Confidential, revealing how the very system that made him a Hollywood sensation also forced him to live a role off-screen. His confession underscored a timeless lesson. In cinema, the most dramatic performance often unfolds far from the camera's gaze. Lupe Velez burst onto screens like dynamite, yet the persona audiences adored was engineered to fit one profitable stereotype. Born Maria Guadalupe Villalobos Velez in 1909, she arrived from Mexico City with comedic brilliance and fearless drive. But studio bosses didn't market nuance. They wanted the fiery Latina of vintage movies and sold her as the Mexican Spitfire, loud, impulsive, uncontainable. Press releases hinted at wealthy ranchero roots she never had, while publicity photos dialed every pose to maximum exotic flair. In classic cinema serials, Velez's accent was exaggerated, her temper scripted, her humor sharpened, so the joke always landed on her own culture. Box office returns soared, but the cage grew smaller. Unlike contemporaries groomed as elegant ingenue, Lupe fought for roles that showed a full range of emotion. Hollywood preferred fireworks over depth. Off-screen, she thundered against those limits, hosting Spanish-language benefits, publicly chastising studios for one-note casting, defiantly rolling her R's in interviews. Gossip columns seized on every romance and quarrel, reinforcing the myth even as she tried to undo it. Her tragic 1944 death became fodder for lurid legend, overshadowing a career that had carved new paths for Latinas in film. Velez's legacy exposes how tightly image and profit were welded in Hollywood movies. Once the industry brand's you, breaking character can be the hardest role of all. In golden-era Hollywood, no actor vanished into roles more completely than Paul Muni. Audiences of classic cinema saw him morph from gangster in Scarface to scientist in The Story of Louis Pasteur, believing he was born for every part. Yet that chameleon talent began with a personal vanishing act. Mooney entered the world in 1895 as Michelem Meyer-Weisenfreund, a Yiddish theater prodigy whose thick European accent and overtly Jewish heritage were barriers in image-obsessed Hollywood movies. The studio solution? A new name, short, American, unforgettable, and a press kit that quietly shifted his birthplace from Lemberg, Galicia, today's Ukraine, to Chicago. Publicists highlighted Midwestern grit, erasing the immigrant struggle that shaped him. Reporters marveled at his innate dialect skills, unaware he'd spent childhood mastering voices backstage to survive. On set, he expanded that survival trick. Hours in makeup chairs, elaborate prosthetics, meticulous study of speech patterns until even friends struggled to recognize him. Executive grumbles that he was unmarketable without disguise only fueled his obsession to disappear further. When The Life of Émile Zola won him an Oscar, Mooney's vanishing act was complete. Audiences believed the French Crusader had somehow learned English for the film. Off camera, he kept the illusion. No lavish parties, few interviews, a private life as disciplined as his craft. In an industry addicted to glamorous myths, Paul Mooney proved a different alchemy of fame. If you can become anyone on screen, you can erase who you were off it. Such was the price and the genius of a star built on invisibility in vintage Hollywood.